The year was 2387, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Union for only 37 years. In the grand scale of the universe, this was nothing more than the blink of an eye. Most species in the Union had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Some had been doing it for millions. Humans were the new kids, the late arrivals, the species that other races looked at with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. Admiral Cole sat in her office at the United Nations Space Command headquarters in Geneva. The building was old by human standards, but equipped with the most advanced technology Earth had to offer. Holographic displays floated in the air around her desk, showing reports from human colonies scattered across 12 star systems. Everything seemed normal until a priority message arrived with a seal she had never seen before. It was from the Galactic Council itself. Read the message 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. The Council was calling an emergency assembly, and they were requesting human presence. This had never happened before. Humans were usually ignored at council meetings, given a small seat in the back where they could watch but rarely participate. For the Council to specifically request them meant something serious was happening. She immediately contacted Daniel Hayes, Earth's most experienced diplomat in alien affairs. Daniel was 52 years old, with gray hair at his temples and calm brown eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. He had started his career as a military strategist, planning operations during Earth's last major conflict. When humanity reached the stars and found they were not alone, Daniel had transitioned into diplomacy. He discovered that understanding your opponent was useful, whether you were fighting them or negotiating with them. Daniel arrived at its office within the hour. He read the message and felt the same cold feeling in his stomach that had experienced. "They've never asked for us before," he said quietly. "I know," replied. "Whatever this is, it's big enough that they want everyone there, even us." Daniel assembled his team quickly. He chose Price as his aide, a young woman of 28 who had a natural gift for languages. She could speak 7 alien tongues fluently and understood the cultural meanings behind words that translators often missed. Her hair was always pulled back in a practical style, and her blue eyes were sharp and observant. For security, Daniel selected Samuel Grant, a former Special Forces operative who had served on 3 different alien worlds. Samuel was a large man with dark skin and a shaved head, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he could be. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. The 3 of them boarded the starship Endeavour, one of humanity's fastest vessels. It was not impressive by galactic standards. The ship was small and functional, built for speed rather than comfort. But it would get them to the council station in 4 days, which was fast enough. During the journey, Daniel studied everything he could find about the current political situation in the galaxy. The Galactic Union was made up of over 200 species, but real power rested with about a dozen major civilizations. The consortium controlled most of the trade routes. The Dominion had the largest military fleet. The ancient collective possessed technology that even other advanced species did not fully understand. Humans had good relations with most species, but they were not taken seriously. They were too young, too inexperienced, too fragile. Other races saw humans as clever animals who had somehow stumbled into space travel. Useful for minor tasks, perhaps, but not important enough to matter in galactic affairs. Spent the journey practicing her diplomatic protocols. Each species had different customs for greeting, for showing respect, for expressing disagreement. A gesture that meant friendship to one race could mean deadly insult to another. She reviewed hundreds of scenarios, preparing for anything. Samuel checked his weapons and equipment. He was not expecting trouble, but he never went anywhere without being ready for it. His job was to keep Daniel alive, and he took that job very seriously. On the 4th day, the Endeavour dropped out of slip space near the council station. Daniel looked through the viewport and felt his breath catch in his throat. The station itself was impressive, a massive structure of crystal and metal that floated in the heart of the Andromeda Nebula. It had been built 10,000 years ago as neutral ground where all species could meet in peace. But it was not the station that caught Daniel's attention. It was the ships. Hundreds of warships surrounded the station, representing every major power in the galaxy. Battle cruisers with their distinctive red hulls, trading vessels converted for combat, ships that seemed to flicker in and out of reality, and dozens of other designs from species Daniel barely recognized. "This isn't a meeting," whispered. "This is a war council." Samuel moved to the sensor station and studied the readings. Every ship out there is armed and ready for battle. Whatever scared them, it scared them badly. Daniel nodded slowly. He had suspected something terrible was happening, but seeing the evidence made it real. These were species that had been arguing and competing with each other for thousands of years. For them to gather like this, setting aside their differences, the threat had to be something beyond anything they had faced before. The Endeavor was directed to a docking port reserved for minor species. Even in crisis, the hierarchy of the galaxy was maintained. Daniel did not complain. He was used to being underestimated, and he had learned that being overlooked could sometimes be an advantage. They were met at the airlock by a protocol officer, a small furry creature from a species called the... The officer seemed nervous, his whiskers twitching constantly as he led them through the station's corridors. "The assembly begins in 2 hours, the officer said in accented standard, the common language of the galaxy. "You will be shown to your observation pod. Please do not speak unless directly addressed by the High Arbiter." Daniel smiled politely. "Of course, we understand our place." Gave him a sideways look. She knew that tone. Daniel was already planning something. They were taken to their assigned pod, a small floating platform near the outer edge of the council chamber. From here, they could see everything but were clearly meant to be spectators rather than participants. Other minor species occupied similar positions around them, all looking just as confused and worried as the human delegation felt. The chamber itself was magnificent, a perfect sphere with no up or down, where gravity was controlled so that each delegation's pod was oriented correctly for their species. Hundreds of pods floated in careful arrangement, with the most powerful species closest to the center. In the very middle was a platform for the High Arbiter, the neutral official who moderated council proceedings. Daniel studied the alien delegates as they arrived. He watched their body language, noted which species were talking to each other and which were keeping their distance. He saw fear in many faces, anger in others, and despair in more than a few. Whatever was coming, the galaxy's leaders already knew about it, and they were terrified. Daniel said softly, "Look at the Admiral." He followed her gaze to where Admiral sat in the delegation's pod. Was legendary, a warrior who had won 100 battles and never known defeat. He was a massive reptilian creature with scales the color of dark emeralds and eyes that burned like fire. And right now, those eyes looked haunted. Daniel had never seen a show fear before. They were bred for combat, raised from birth to face death without flinching. If something could frighten Admiral, it could frighten anyone. The last delegates took their positions. The chamber fell silent. And then the High Arbiter appeared on the central platform, ready to reveal why the galaxy was gathering for war. Daniel Hayes took a deep breath and prepared to hear the worst news of his life. High Arbiter Hun rose on the central platform, and the entire chamber went completely silent. Hun was an species that had served as neutral mediators for the Galactic Union for over 6,000 years. His body was covered in dark chitinous armor, and his 4 arms moved in precise, deliberate gestures as he activated the holographic display system. Daniel watched carefully from humanity's small pod at the edge of the chamber. He had met Hun once before, at a minor trade negotiation. The High Arbiter had been calm and professional then, almost bored by the routine business of galactic politics. Now, his movements were stiff with tension, and his compound eyes kept darting to the other delegates as if he was measuring their reactions in advance. "Representatives of the Galactic Union," Hun began, his clicking speech rendered into standard by the translation system. "I have called this emergency assembly to address a threat that concerns every living being in our galaxy. What I am about to show you is not speculation or theory. It is confirmed by multiple independent sources and by our most advanced sensor networks." He gestured with two of his arms, and the central holographic display came to life. At first, Daniel did not understand what he was seeing. It looked like a cloud of some kind, a dark mass moving through space. Then the scale indicator appeared at the bottom of the display, and he felt his blood run cold. The cloud was made of ships, thousands upon thousands of vessels, each one roughly the size of Earth's moon. They were moving in perfect formation, emerging from the darkness between galaxies like a swarm of locusts descending on a field of grain. Several delegates made sounds of distress. One species, a group of crystalline beings that communicated through vibration, shattered two of their smaller members from sheer shock. Medical teams rushed to assist them as Hun continued. 12 standard cycles ago, our long-range probes in Sector 7 detected unusual readings at the edge of known space. We sent investigation teams. They did not return. We sent more probes. The images they transmitted before being destroyed showed us this fleet. He paused, letting the horror sink in. "The harvesters have returned." The reaction in the chamber was immediate and violent. Species that had been sitting in dignified silence began shouting, demanding information, calling for emergency measures. Several delegations tried to leave their pods, only to be stopped by security fields. The noise was overwhelming, a chaos of untranslated alien languages all expressing the same primal fear. Daniel turned to, "What do you know about the harvesters?" Her face was pale. "Only rumors, old stories that the senior species tell. I thought they were myths." Hun raised all four arms, and the chamber slowly fell quiet again. His voice was heavy with ancient grief when he spoke. "For those young species who do not know our history, I will explain. The harvesters are a machine intelligence, created billions of years ago by a civilization that no longer exists. Their original purpose is unknown. Perhaps they were mining vessels, or terraforming equipment, or weapons of war. What we know is what they do now." The holographic display changed, showing recordings from ancient archives. Daniel watched in horror as the harvesters descended on a planet, stripping it of all resources, all life, all matter that could be processed and consumed. In hours, a thriving world was reduced to a barren rock. The fleet moved on, leaving nothing behind. "They harvest everything," Hun continued. "Organic life, mineral resources, even the atmosphere of planets. They process it all into fuel and raw materials for their endless expansion. And every few million years, when the galaxy has recovered enough to be worth harvesting again, they return." An elderly delegate raised a tentacle to speak. They were ancient beyond measure, their species older than most of the stars in the galaxy. Their representative was called the Voice of Depths, and when she spoke, even the most powerful species listened. "We remember the last harvest," she said, her voice like wind through crystal caves. 12,000 years ago. We were young then, barely able to travel between worlds. We survived only by hiding in the spaces between dimensions, watching as the galaxy burned around us." She paused, her luminous body flickering with what might have been emotion. "The civilization that existed before us, the ones who built the great wonders we still do not understand, they tried to fight. They had technology far beyond anything we possess today. They failed. The harvesters consumed them utterly. We found only ruins and ghosts." Admiral stood in his pod, his massive form radiating barely contained fury. "Then we must fight harder. The Dominion has the largest military fleet in the Union. Give us the location of their main force, and we will destroy them." Hun's reply was gentle, almost pitying. "Admiral, we have already run the simulations. 10,000 different scenarios using every possible combination of our forces. The results are consistent." He displayed the projections on the hologram. Daniel studied them carefully, his strategic mind analyzing the numbers even as his heart sank. "Our combined fleets represent approximately 40,000 combat-capable vessels," Hun explained. "The Harvester Armada contains over 2 million ships, each one more heavily armed than our largest battle cruisers. In direct engagement, we would be overwhelmed within weeks. In guerrilla warfare, we might last a few years, but the end result is always the same." He let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "At their current speed, the harvesters will reach our outer colonies in 14 standard months. Within 3 years, they will have consumed everything, every planet, every station, every ship, every living being in the galaxy." The chamber erupted again, but this time the noise was different. It was the sound of hope dying. Daniel watched the alien delegates carefully. The ambassador, a graceful being with skin that glowed like moonlight, was weeping silently, luminous tears running down her face. The warriors looked like they wanted to fight something, anything, but there was nothing to fight against except mathematics. The smaller species huddled in their pods, already accepting their extinction. Proposals began to emerge from the chaos. The suggested evacuation, a desperate flight to another galaxy that would take generations and could only save a tiny fraction of the population. They offered to share their dimensional hiding technology, but it could only protect a few million beings at most. Other species proposed surrender, hoping that the harvesters might spare some of them if they did not resist. None of the proposals offered real hope. They were the last desperate measures of people who had already accepted defeat. Daniel sat in his pod, listening to civilization prepare for its end. Was crying quietly beside him, and even Samuel looked shaken, his professional composure cracked by the scale of the disaster. But Daniel was not ready to give up. He had spent his entire career studying strategy, and one principle had guided him through every challenge. There was always another option, always a move that the enemy did not expect, always a chance, no matter how small, to change the game. He began reviewing the tactical data that Hun had shared with all delegates. The harvesters were machines, which meant they operated on logic. They had patterns, predictable behaviors, weaknesses that could be exploited. Their last victory had been against a civilization that fought in a certain way, using certain tactics. What if someone fought differently? Daniel thought about human history. He thought about the wars that humanity had fought against itself, the terrible creativity that his species had applied to the art of destruction. He thought about guerrilla fighters who had defeated empires, about defenders who had held positions against impossible odds, about soldiers who had refused to surrender when every rational calculation said they should. Humans were not the strongest species. They did not have the best technology or the most advanced culture, but they had something else, something that Daniel was only now beginning to understand might be valuable. Humans had spent their entire existence learning how to fight when they should not be able to win. He raised his hand and requested permission to address the assembly. Grabbed his arm. "Daniel, what are you doing?" "Something stupid," he replied. "Possibly something suicidal, but definitely something human." Hun noticed the request from the human delegation. He seemed surprised, but perhaps desperate enough to allow any voice to be heard. He granted permission. Daniel stood in his small pod at the edge of the chamber, his image projected to the central display so that all 200 species could see him. He was small and soft and fragile, a member of a race that most of the galaxy considered barely civilized. And he was about to tell them they were all fighting the wrong way. Daniel stood alone in the spotlight of the holographic projection system, his image so that every delegate in the chamber could see him clearly. He was aware of how he must look to them. Small, fragile, young, a representative of a species that had been traveling between stars for barely a generation, standing before civilizations that had existed since before humanity's ancestors climbed down from the trees. He could feel S's worried gaze on his back and Samuel's steady presence nearby. They trusted him. He hoped that trust was not misplaced. "Distinguished delegates," Daniel began, keeping his voice calm and measured, "I have listened to your proposals with great respect. The plan for evacuation shows compassion for future generations. The offer to share their hiding technology demonstrates generosity beyond what anyone could expect. Every suggestion made in this chamber comes from a place of wisdom and experience." He paused, making eye contact with as many delegates as he could through the holographic display. "But I believe there is another option, one that has not been considered because it seems impossible by the standards of galactic warfare." Admiral leaned forward in his pod, his reptilian eyes narrowing with interest. "Speak, human. What option do you see that our tacticians have missed?" "We fight," Daniel said simply. The response was immediate. Laughter erupted from several pods, a mixture of clicking and hissing, and sounds that the translator could not properly render. The ambassador shook her luminous head sadly. Even the voice of depths made a sound that might have been a sigh. "Did you not hear the projections?" asked the ambassador, her tone gentle as if speaking to a child. "Our combined forces cannot defeat them. The mathematics are absolute. Fighting is not courage, young human. It is suicide." Daniel nodded. "You are correct. Your combined forces, using your current tactics, cannot defeat them. Your simulations prove this conclusively." He activated his own data display, showing tactical analyses he had been preparing during the presentation. "But I have studied your battle strategies. With great respect to the military traditions of every species here, I must point out something that may be uncomfortable to hear." He took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say could end his diplomatic career. But careers did not matter when extinction was on the table. "You fight like civilized beings." Confusion spread through the chamber. Several delegates exchanged glances, unsure whether they had been insulted or complimented. "You meet your enemies in formal engagements," Daniel continued. "You follow rules of war that have existed for thousands of years. You calculate acceptable losses before committing to battle. You consider certain tactics dishonorable and refuse to use them. You treat warfare as an extension of politics, a regulated contest with boundaries and limitations." He brought up footage from Earth's history, the archives of human conflict, carefully selected to make his point without revealing too much about humanity's capacity for violence. "Humans do not fight like that." The display showed images of guerrilla warfare, small groups of fighters using terrain and surprise to defeat larger forces, traps designed to break morale as much as bodies, tactics that valued victory over honor, survival over glory. "We are a species that spent our entire existence fighting ourselves. We developed what we call total war, where every resource, every person, every piece of ground becomes part of the battle. We learned to fight when outnumbered. We learned to fight when. We learned to fight when surrounded and cut off and abandoned by our allies." The chamber was silent now, the laughter replaced by something more complex. Daniel could see alien minds processing information that did not fit their expectations. "Your previous galactic civilization fought the harvesters with superior technology and lost, but they fought with rules. They fought with honor. They fought the way that advanced, civilized beings fight." He let his voice drop to something barely above a whisper, forcing every delegate to lean forward and listen. "We will fight like animals, like savages, like a species that has nothing to lose and everything to gain. We will use every dirty trick, every dishonorable tactic, every weapon that your treaties have banned and your ethics have forbidden. Admiral was staring at Daniel with an expression that might have been horror or fascination. You speak of war crimes, human, of atrocities. I speak of survival, Daniel replied. The harvesters do not care about our rules. They do not follow our ethics. They will not spare civilians or respect surrenders or honor treaties. They will consume everything without hesitation or remorse. He pulled up more data, this time showing the harvester fleet in detail. They are machines. Ancient machines, yes. Powerful machines, certainly, but still machines. They operate on logic, on patterns, on predictable behaviors programmed into them billions of years ago. Every enemy they have faced has fought them the same way, force against force, ships against ships. They expect this. They are designed to defeat this. Daniel smiled, and there was something in that smile that made several delegates uncomfortable. They have never faced an enemy that fights the way humans fight. He outlined his proposal step by step. Strike teams targeting the command nodes that coordinated the harvester network. Weapons designed to exploit the gaps between their shields and their sensors. Psychological warfare against an enemy that might still retain enough organic programming to feel something like fear. Sabotage, assassination, terror. We will make them afraid to advance, Daniel said. We will make every system they enter a trap. We will make them pay for every planet, every station, every ship with losses they cannot afford. And when they begin to hesitate, when they begin to recalculate their plans, we will hit them harder. The voice of depths raised a tentacle. You speak of strategies that would require abandoning everything we have built, our treaties, our laws, our very concept of civilization. Yes, Daniel admitted. I know what I am asking. I know the cost. But I also know what happens if we do not pay that cost. The harvesters do not care about our civilization. They will destroy it whether we preserve our honor or not. He looked directly at the ancient. You survived the last harvest by hiding. You watched a galaxy die while you stayed safe in your dimensional shelters. Do you want to spend the next 1,000,000 years hiding again? Do you want to tell the species that rise from our ashes that you could have helped but chose to preserve your ethics instead? The voice of depths was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with something that might have been shame or determination. The human speaks harsh truth. We have always regretted our cowardice in the last harvest, though we told ourselves it was wisdom. Perhaps this time we should choose differently. Admiral stood in his pod, his massive form somehow seeming larger than before. They have always believed that the manner of fighting matters as much as victory. We have looked down on species that use dishonorable tactics. He turned to face Daniel directly. But honor means nothing if there is no one left to remember it. If this human has a plan that gives us a chance, any chance, then the Dominion will listen. One by one, other species began to speak. Some were horrified by what Daniel proposed. Some were intrigued. Some simply wanted to know more before they decided. But for the first time since the assembly began, there was something in the chamber besides despair. There was hope. Daniel Felt's hand gripped his shoulder, and he reached up to squeeze it gently. They had crossed the first barrier. The galaxy was willing to listen. Now he had to convince them to actually do it. The debate in the council chamber lasted for 3 full days. Delegates argued, threatened, pleaded, and sometimes simply sat in stunned silence as they tried to process what Daniel Hayes was asking them to do. The comfortable rules that had governed galactic civilization were being challenged by a species that most of them had considered irrelevant. Daniel barely slept during those 3 days. He moved from pod to pod, meeting with delegations, answering questions, addressing concerns. Translated for him when the universal translator missed cultural nuances, and Samuel stood silently at his side, a reminder that humans were more than just clever talkers. They were the hardest to convince. Their civilization was built on principles of harmony and mutual respect. The tactics Daniel described went against everything they believed in. Their ambassador, a being called, met with Daniel privately on the second day. "You ask us to become monsters," she said, her glowing skin flickering with distress, "to abandon the ethics that make us who we are." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand your concern, but let me ask you something. What happens to your children if we lose?" Was silent. "I have read about culture," Daniel continued. "Your young ones spend their first 10 years in communal nurseries, surrounded by art and music and love. They learn to see beauty in all things, to value peace above conflict. It takes decades to raise a child properly." He leaned forward. "The harvesters will not care about any of that. They will process your nurseries the same way they process mineral deposits. Your children will be converted to fuel for their engines. Every painting, every song, every memory of your civilization will be erased as completely as if it never existed." Slight dim to almost nothing. "You paint a terrible picture." "I paint the truth. The question is whether you would rather preserve your ethics and watch your children die, or set aside your ethics temporarily and give them a chance to live." The ambassador was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "If we do this, if we become what you ask, can we ever return to what we were?" Daniel thought about Earth's history, about the wars that had humanity, and the long, difficult process of healing that followed each one. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know that dead civilizations cannot heal. Dead civilizations cannot grow or change or become better. The only way forward is through survival." On the third day, announced that the consortium would support the human plan. The Dominion had already declared their support. An admiral had begun working with Daniel on the military aspects of the strategy. The reptilian warrior had a sharp tactical mind, and he quickly grasped concepts that other species found disturbing. "Your people call this guerrilla warfare," said during one of their planning sessions. "Strike and fade, hit the enemy where they are weak, then disappear before they can respond." "Exactly," Daniel confirmed. "The harvesters are used to enemies that stand and fight. They have overwhelming force, so direct confrontation plays to their strengths. We need to change the game entirely." He pulled up a holographic display showing the structure of the harvester fleet. "These are their command nodes. The harvesters are machines, but they still need coordination. Remove the nodes and the individual ships become much less effective. They will revert to basic programming, easier to predict and defeat." Studied the display with hungry eyes. A decapitation strike, cut off the head and the body dies. More like cutting the nerves. The body will still move, but it won't be able to think or coordinate. We hit the nodes with small, fast teams while our main fleet engages their attention elsewhere. The voice of depth joined their planning sessions, bringing the ancient wisdom of the. Her species had survived the last harvest by hiding, but they had also observed. They understood how the harvesters thought, what drove their endless consumption. "They are not evil," she explained during one late-night session. "They do not hate organic life. They simply do not recognize it as anything other than resources. To them, we are no different from asteroid ore or gas giant atmospheres, material to be processed." Daniel found this somehow more disturbing than if the harvesters had been driven by malice. Fighting an enemy that hated you was one thing. Fighting an enemy that did not even acknowledge your existence as meaningful was something else entirely. "Can we communicate with them?" asked. "Perhaps negotiate some kind of arrangement." The voice of depths made a sound like wind through broken glass. "Many tried during the last harvest. The harvesters do not negotiate. They do not respond to messages. They simply continue their function as they have for billions of years." While the strategic planning continued, Samuel was busy with his own assignment. He had contacted Earth's most classified military installations, the ones that officially did not exist, and arranged for certain prototypes to be shipped to the front lines. Humanity had always known that they might someday need to defend themselves against their alien neighbors. They had hoped that day would never come, but they had prepared anyway. Deep in underground facilities, human scientists had developed weapons based on principles that the Galactic Union considered too dangerous to pursue. Singularity bombs that created miniature black holes, dimensional disruptors that tore holes in the fabric of space itself, neural scramblers that could shut down organic minds from a distance, and worse things, weapons that humanity had built and then locked away, hoping they would never be needed. Now they were needed. A new command structure was established, combining forces from every species that had agreed to join the alliance. Daniel was appointed chief strategist, a position that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Admiral commanded the military forces, while the voice of depths provided intelligence and technological support. Suggested a name for their combined fleet, the Last Light. It captured both the desperation of their situation and their determination to remain the final beacon against the darkness. The name resonated across cultural boundaries, and it was adopted unanimously. The 14 months before the harvesters arrived were filled with frantic preparation. Shipyards that had been building commercial vessels were converted to military production. Mining operations focused on materials needed for weapons rather than trade goods. Entire populations were relocated from the outer colonies, which would be the first targets of the invasion. Daniel worked 20-hour days, sleeping only when his body refused to function without rest. He trained alien officers in human tactics, explaining concepts that their military academies had never considered. He designed operations that would have horrified his younger self, plans that involved sacrificing millions to save billions. Became his voice to the civilian populations, explaining what was coming and what sacrifices would be required. She had a gift for finding the right words, for making terrible truths bearable. When people asked why they should follow a human strategy, she told them about Earth's history, about the times when her species had faced extinction and refused to accept it. Samuel led the special operations training, teaching alien soldiers how to think like human commandos. It was difficult work. Most species had ingrained resistance to the tactics he taught, instincts that told them such methods were wrong. He had to break those instincts down and rebuild them. The enemy does not care about fair fights, he told his students repeatedly. The enemy does not care about honor. The enemy does not care about you at all. Your only job is to survive and hurt them. Everything else is luxury. Some of his students could not accept this philosophy. They from the program, unable to abandon the principles they had been raised with. Samuel did not judge them. He simply moved on to those who could learn. As the months passed, the Last Light fleet took shape. It was not the largest military force in galactic history, but it was perhaps the most diverse and certainly the most unconventional. Ships from 200 species flying together, each one carrying weapons and tactics that would have been considered war crimes just a year earlier. Daniel stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity, watching the fleet assemble, and Samuel stood beside him, along with Admiral and the voice of depths. "It is not enough," said quietly. "Even with all of this, the odds are against us." Daniel nodded. "I know, but we are not trying to win through strength. We are trying to win through will. The harvesters expect their enemies to calculate odds and surrender when those odds become hopeless. We will not surrender. We will fight until we cannot fight anymore, and then we will find ways to keep fighting." He looked at the assembled fleet, at the hopes of an entire galaxy resting on their desperate plan. "They have never faced an enemy like us. Let us show them what that means." The harvesters emerged from slip space at the edge of the outer rim exactly 14 months after their detection. Their fleet was even larger than the initial projections had suggested, a wall of moon-sized vessels stretching across the darkness like a second night falling over the stars. Their advanced scouts moved forward, sensors sweeping the space ahead for targets and resources. They found nothing. The evacuation had been complete. Every colony, every station, every ship had been pulled back, leaving empty systems where life had once flourished. The machines processed this data and adjusted their approach. Empty systems were inefficient but not unexpected. Prey species sometimes fled before the harvest. The harvesters had encountered this behavior before. They simply advanced further, confident that eventually they would find what they sought. That was when the first mines activated. Daniel had positioned them carefully over the past months, working with engineers to create weapons unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They combined human nuclear technology with dimensional folding, creating devices that did not simply explode but tore holes in the fabric of reality itself. Thousands of harvester ships vanished in the first wave, pulled into dimensional rifts that scattered their atoms across multiple realities. The survivors barely had time to register the attack before the second wave hit. From hidden positions throughout the system, strike teams emerged. Each team was small, no more than a dozen ships, led by a human commander supported by mixed crews from every allied species. They did not attack the main fleet. They targeted the command nodes, the processing centers that coordinated harvester operations. Christopher led one of these teams. He was 27 years old, a pilot who had grown up on Mars and joined the fleet because he could not stand the idea of sitting safely on Earth while others fought for him. His squadron consisted of 3 human vessels, 2 interceptors, and 4 stealth craft. Their target was a node ship near the center of the harvester formation. Getting to it required passing through layers of defensive fire that would have been impossible for any conventional attack. But Chris and his team were not using conventional tactics. They used the harvester's own formation against them, slipping between the massive vessels where their weapons could not fire without hitting their own ships. They moved erratically, changing direction constantly, never giving the machine minds time to calculate their trajectory. It was dangerous flying, the kind that killed pilots who hesitated or made mistakes. Chris did not hesitate. He did not make mistakes. His team reached the node ship and deployed their payload, a cluster of neural scramblers designed to disrupt the quantum processes that allowed harvester ships to communicate. The effect was immediate. Hundreds of vessels in the surrounding area suddenly stopped coordinating their movements, reverting to basic programming that made them predictable and slow. Across the battle zone, other strike teams achieved similar successes. The harvester advance stalled, then began to fragment as their network suffered cascade failures. Ships that had been moving with perfect synchronization now bumped into each other, fired on friendly targets, or simply stopped moving entirely. Daniel watched the battle unfold from the bridge of the Unity, coordinating the countless individual operations that made up his overall strategy. He had not slept in 3 days, sustained only by stimulants and the desperate need to see his plan through. Stood beside him, monitoring communications from across the galaxy. Reports flooded in from every sector where harvester forces had been engaged. The news was mixed. Some operations had succeeded brilliantly. Others had failed catastrophically, leaving entire fleets destroyed and millions dead. "We are losing ships faster than projected," she reported, her voice steady despite the horror in the numbers she was reading. Daniel nodded. "I know, but we are hurting them faster too. That is all that matters right now." The war continued for 2 years. It was not a war of great battles and decisive victories. It was a war of attrition, of grinding, endless conflict that drained both sides to their limits. The last light fleet lost nearly half its vessels in the first year alone. Entire species suffered casualties that would take generations to recover from. Heroes rose and fell, their names added to lists that grew longer every day. But the harvesters suffered too. They had never faced an enemy that fought this way, that refused to engage in direct combat, that struck from shadows and disappeared before retaliation could arrive. Their programming struggled to adapt to tactics that violated every pattern they had been designed to counter. Human commanders led operations that other species considered suicidal. They attacked supply lines that the harvesters had never needed to protect before. They planted viruses in processing centers, corrupting data streams and causing systems to malfunction. They used weapons that the Galactic Union had banned centuries ago, weapons that left scars on space itself. Admiral fell in battle during the 17th month, leading a desperate defense of a colony world that could not be evacuated in time. His final transmission became a rallying cry for the Alliance. Today we teach them fear. The voice of depth sacrificed herself to deploy a dimensional anchor that prevented a harvester force from escaping to regroup. Her last words were a prayer in the ancient tongue, asking forgiveness for the violence she had embraced and blessing those who would carry on the fight. Samuel Grant died protecting a civilian evacuation transport, buying time for 300,000 refugees to escape. He never spoke a word during the final engagement, but the records showed that he smiled as his ship rammed into the harvester vessel pursuing them. Wept when she heard the news. Daniel simply added Samuel's name to the list and returned to planning the next operation. There would be time for grief later, if there was a later at all. In the final months of the war, everything changed. Analysis of captured harvester debris revealed a weakness that no one had expected. The command network that coordinated their fleet was not distributed evenly. It had a central hub, a single vessel that processed all high-level decisions and distributed instructions to the rest. If that vessel could be destroyed, the entire harvester fleet would become leaderless. Christopher volunteered for the mission. His ship had been damaged beyond proper repair, held together with emergency patches and determination. He knew he would not be coming back. Daniel tried to find another way. He spent 3 sleepless nights running simulations, looking for any option that did not require sacrifice. There was none. The command vessel was too heavily protected for any conventional attack. Only a suicide run had a chance of success. Chris sent one final message before beginning his approach. "Tell them we did not go quietly." His ship carried a payload of experimental singularity bombs, weapons so dangerous that even building them had required special authorization from every government in the Alliance. He piloted through defensive fire that destroyed his shields, his weapons, and most of his hull. Warning systems screamed at him to eject, to save himself while there was still time. He ignored them. The impact was visible from 3 star systems away. The singularity bombs activated inside the command vessel, creating a cascade of miniature black holes that tore the massive ship apart from within. The explosion sent shockwaves through the harvester network, disrupting communications and causing failures throughout their entire fleet. Without coordination, the remaining harvester ships became simple machines. They continued to function on basic programming, but they could no longer adapt or strategize or respond to complex threats. The last light fleet, battered and exhausted but still fighting, swept through them systematically. The war ended not with a final great battle but with a long, grinding cleanup operation. Harvester ships were destroyed or disabled one by one. Their processing facilities were dismantled. Their remnants were scattered across the galaxy, too damaged to ever threaten anyone again. 1 year later, Daniel Hayes stood in the council chamber where everything had begun. The chamber looked the same, pods floating in their careful arrangement around the central platform, but everything else had changed. Humanity's pod was no longer at the edge. It sat near the center, beside the other great powers who had earned their positions through of achievement, and Daniel was not standing in his pod. He was on the central platform itself, addressing the assembly as an equal. "You asked us once what humans could contribute to this union," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "We were young. We were inexperienced. We had barely learned to travel between stars while you had been doing it for ages beyond our comprehension." He paused, looking at the delegates who had doubted him, who had laughed at his proposal, who had thought humanity too primitive to matter. "Now you know what we bring. We bring our capacity for hope when hope seems foolish. We bring our refusal to accept defeat when defeat seems certain. We bring our willingness to sacrifice everything for those we love." His eyes found in the human delegation's new pod. She was crying, but she was also smiling. They had lost so much. Samuel, the voice of depths, millions upon millions of lives across every species in the Alliance. The cost had been terrible beyond measure. But they had survived. "We brought you our stubborn, foolish, beautiful humanity," Daniel continued. "And together we did not just survive, we won." The chamber erupted in sounds of approval from 200 species. Clicks and whistles and roars and frequencies that human ears could not detect. It was the sound of a galaxy celebrating its continued existence, acknowledging the species that had taught them how to fight for their lives. Daniel stepped down from the platform, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Met him at the edge of the chamber, wrapping her arms around him. "We did it," she whispered. He held her close, thinking of everyone who had not lived to see this moment. Chris, whose final flight had ended the war. Samuel Grant, who had died as he lived, protecting others. Admiral and the voice of depths, and countless others whose names would be remembered for as long as civilization existed. "They did it," Daniel corrected softly. "We just helped." Outside the chamber's viewports, the stars shone peacefully. The galaxy had been saved. Humanity had found its place among the stars, not as the youngest or the weakest, but as the species that had taught an entire civilization how to fight for its life. And somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, the scattered remnants of the harvesters drifted silently, serving as an eternal reminder of what happened when the universe underestimated humanity.